Hello, I'm Philip Land. I'm a lawyer at Haynsworth, Sinkler, Boyd, and I'm here today to present on the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS as it's called. I'll start by giving a little bit of my background, a little bit of the background on CFIUS in general, and how it applies to economic development across the Southeast. So the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, this is a federal level issue. It is an interagency committee related to basically every area of government. All the major agencies have a seat and they coordinate together to review whether or not a project poses a national security risk. Historically, the activity around CFIUS related to M&A. And a classic example would be if the owner of TikTok wanted to buy Facebook. The US government would step in and highly scrutinize that transaction, probably wouldn't allow it to go forward because the owners of ByteDance are considered to be national adversaries. However, this doesn't just apply to our adversaries. And in fact, a lot of the CFIUS review, only our strongest allies are exempt, and countries that are extremely strong allies like Germany and Japan are also not exempt. So how does this relate to economic development? Because we're not talking about M&A today. So what we've seen a growth in CFIUS is its scrutiny towards real estate related transactions. CFIUS does have the authority to review a real estate transaction if it is in a certain proximity from critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure definitionally includes airports, seaports, military bases, government facilities, think about power providers, and it has a broad range. So we're looking at 99 miles, which could theoretically trigger CFIUS review. Now, why should we care as economic developers, and what are the consequences for ignoring CFIUS? Let's be honest here. A lot of times CFIUS review has fallen to the wayside. And the reason it's fallen to the wayside is because there's what's called a greenfield exemption under the law. And many of the projects we work with truly are a foreign company's very first investment in the United States. And so CFIUS is seen to be sort of optional. It's been around for decades now, and here we are, and it's not usually part of the economic development community's process. However, what we're seeing in CFIUS is a growing trend, and what I would call an erosion of that greenfield exemption, because whereas you can still rely on it, but I'd say you can still rely on it sort of. And I'll give you a couple examples of where recently that's caused problems. So as I mentioned, we're talking about real estate related transactions. And while I'm no real estate lawyer, I'm not a dirt lawyer, I'm really more of an international lawyer and a corporate lawyer, and an economic development lawyer. All economic development deals in the manufacturing sector particularly have a real estate component. A lot of those are located somewhere 99 miles from a piece of critical infrastructure. So this type of work is federal, but in my home state, it would be really hard to draw a radius from a military base and avoid a 99-mile proximity from one of those. Furthermore, the Charlotte Airport is a piece of critical infrastructure. It would be very difficult to draw a 99-mile radius from one of those pieces of infrastructure and not hit some economic development deals. And so, as I mentioned, the greenfield acquisitions or greenfield developments, ground up manufacturers are technically exempt under the law. However, I'm going to give you two examples. One is a North Dakota project. And I think this was, I don't have the date here, this was summer before last, but Fufang Group acquired a large site for a proposed corn milling project. $700 million investment, happened to be 12 miles from the Grand Forks military base. Um, this project did not file for CFIUS review. And so it did not go to CFIUS and say, hey, we have a project here we think is a problem, or think could be a problem, we'd like your input. The community was up in arms about it, called for CFIUS review. And per news reports, CFIUS ultimately said that it did not have jurisdiction over this project because this particular military installation was not on the sites that were subject to CFIUS jurisdiction. I think we've seen growing concern among the base in many places. You've seen a lot of states propose legislation that limits foreign direct investment. And as that grows, legislators who are particularly opposed to international investment in their districts really only have CFIUS to turn to for scrutiny. So with this particular project, CFIUS said no jurisdiction. Can you give you another example, though, a little more severe and more recent? So as of May, there was a Chinese-owned energy project called Mine 1, and it was located next to an Air Force base in Wyoming. And what's interesting about this deal is it was, as I understand it, already out of the ground running. And so the project was operational, and the president came in. Well, actually, let me back up. I'll talk more about what's called the non-notified team. And the non-notified team of CFIUS came in and looked closely at the transaction, recommended to the president that the deal be blocked and unwound. And the president made an executive order that under CFIUS, this deal be unwound. And the project had a very tight timetable that it had to be completely shut down and divested. So the non-notified team has seen an increase in their activity. So the non-notified team, they call themselves, it's a little cheesy, but they call themselves the junkyard dogs. And what they consider their job to be is affirmatively to go out and find deals that have not already filed with CFIUS and told them about it. There was a time when the non-notified team largely read the front cover of the Wall Street Journal and looked through the CFIUS deals to see whether or not that particular deal had filed with CFIUS, and if they hadn't, they'd go and knock on the door, so to speak. This has been a rapidly growing team within CFIUS, so that if there are announcements, you will find that the non-notified team can come and knock on the door, as it were, in order to ask for more information and basically ask that particular project to file a CFIUS notice. So Mine 1, this was the deal that was unwound by the president. What's the lesson to be learned here? The lesson, and you hear CFIUS practitioners say that trust is the coin of the realm. And you'll find, I believe, fewer and fewer deals, fewer and fewer foreign direct investment deals will rely on the greenfield exception because they want to be seen by CFIUS as being disclosing and proactive, as opposed to relying on, one of my mentors says, whistling past the graveyard and expecting that maybe they won't get caught, because the chances of them getting caught, so to speak, are much higher now that the non-notified team is increasing their activity. I do want to pause here and note that this is an entirely I would say nonpartisan. Well, and what I mean by that is every single US president in recent memory has taken some action under CFIUS. And CFIUS's activity has grown under every administration. So I wouldn't expect, we're coming up on an election year, or we're in an election year coming up on an election. I wouldn't expect the outcome of the election to change a current trend, which is that every United States president has taken action under CFIUS jurisdiction. And CFIUS has continued to grow, notwithstanding what party is in the White House. So I'm going to take a minute now. I'm going to walk you through a hypothetical project. And after I do the project, I'm going to tell you how can you mitigate the risk and what legal actions you can take in order to see that your projects run more smoothly and don't get unwound like the Mine One deal did. So I'm going to talk about a project barrel. I've made this up entirely, but let's just say Project Barrel is an existing company within the United States. This is a map of their current operation and offices in the United States, but they contact your community and say, hey, we want to do an expansion of one of our facilities, and we're not sure which one, but we need some pretty important items. We need reliable power, available workforce, access to airports, and a seaport, a shipping port. Very common setup here. And let's say that's a $50 million and 150 jobs. I just want it to be something that each community would really want to see. Well, I'm going to narrow this to near where I sit today. While I'm from South Carolina, I sit up in Greenville, South Carolina. And so let's say they've got the site generally narrowed down to two here. One's in Georgia, one's in outside of Columbia, South Carolina. And let's say that I'm going to look at this from a perspective of an economic developer in South Carolina who's actively recruiting the project. So again, the important items to the project are reliable power, available workforce, access to an airport, and seaport. So you're an economic developer in South Carolina who wants to land this project to the greater Columbia area, as you'll see here. And you say to yourself, okay, you need reliable power. Let me tell you what, we've got a power plant right up the road. You need great workforce. Our military base is producing young, capable, trained, mature workforce ready to work. You need an airport. Let me tell you what, Charlotte Airport, short drive away. And the Port of Charleston, you can ship whatever you need from internationally 2 hours from this particular site. So while I'm telling the story of South Carolina here, I think I'm telling the story of many communities across the Southeast. And while all four of these may not be characteristic of your location, likely one of them is. And certainly think about this in terms of, is one of these within 99 miles? So you find out that there's a reliable name behind this project. Smithfield, for example, or MG, Volvo, Dirt Devil, Motorola. Well, all these are great companies. They're also ultimately owned by Chinese entities, or they're controlled by Chinese entities. So this project suddenly becomes a little bit different. And keep in mind, I work with the Chinese. Chinese projects can be great. I'm certainly not a xenophobe. I don't think anybody who can work in this industry can be xenophobic. I think we welcome foreign direct investment and international exchange. And again, CFIUS is not limited to China. Okay, so I could have used examples from Germany or Japan too, because neither Germany nor Japan are on the list of exempt countries. I use those particularly because they represent the first and second sources, largest sources of foreign direct investment in my region. So nothing really went wrong yet. I would suggest and submit to the economic development community that An additional item of diligence as you are evaluating projects should be who controls this company? Who controls this company? And it's not a question that many economic development individuals, professionals ask, because what we're interested in is a balance sheet. Are they bona fide, or is this a startup? We're interested in what are their capital expenditures? What are their current operations? Is the project competitive? How many people do they need to hire? What's their power requirements? And who controls the company, and what country are the people who control the company from, or what entity controls the company, is usually not in the list of questions that I'm seeing people ask. I would suggest that a thorough analysis of projects could include that very question, because the issue can be avoided. What I'd hate to see is a great project get off the ground, up and running, and then suddenly the non-notified team comes knocking and suggests that maybe that investment should have filed for CFIUS. And by the way, we're not as trusting as we were before. So I mentioned that proximity. What we're talking about again is real estate transactions, which can be a lease or an acquisition, within proximity to certain military installations. So you say to yourself, well, how do I know if there's an issue? Sure, we've got a military base up the road. I don't know if particular sites within that radius, I don't know if that particular military base is important to CFIUS or not. Well, I've included a link here in the presentation of what's called a geographic reference tool. And if you want to be specific, 802 transactions are real estate transactions. And so CFIUS 802 transactions deal specifically with real estate. The mapping tool here is interactive, and it's quite easy to use. It's not entirely comprehensive, though. It's just step one. So as you're evaluating that project barrel that I mentioned earlier, and you don't know who the company is, and now you've listened to this brilliant presentation, and you say to yourself, okay, Philip Land said I should ask who controls the company. And you figure out that the company is actually under foreign control by somebody located overseas. That may not be Canada, or it might not be the UK. Let's say Japan, Germany, or China. And you say to yourself, all right, well, I maybe need to do one extra step of diligence here, as I'm considering recruiting this project and considering whether it would be a problem. And so that extra step is this mapping tool. And again, it's very easy to use. You'll see on your screen that there's a place for your address to be plugged in. And it's that simple. And so in my example, remember the project was considering the greater Columbia, South Carolina region, and you would just type in that particular address, and it would present to you. You can see on the map these colors, and I wish I had it interactive for you. But as you zoom in closer and closer to that, and that it'll pop up in that address, you will see you'll see the location of the project, and you'll see this will produce a list of any concerning infrastructure within 99 miles of that address. That's not really the last thing you need to do, though, because this is a nice, candidly easy way to flag a potential issue. And when you do flag a potential issue, that is a good opportunity to reach out to someone who practices law in this area, or who has particular specialty in this area, because not every site on the United States map that the 802 geographic tool has is really going to flag CFIUS jurisdiction. It is definitely cause for concern, but not every single data point currently on the map is going to be a problem. So do not kill projects because they're within 99 miles of a base. That would be the worst thing you could do, and not that you would do it anyways, but just understand there's possibility to get around this. So how do you get around this, so to speak, or how do you be, that's like not the best way to put it. How do you address this? Um, so when you have a project, and let's do the same project I've been talking about, this Project Barrel. It's a expansion, or even better, a first investment in the United States by this company. Um, Usually what you see a practitioner file for a real estate deal with that fact pattern is what's called a declaration. And a declaration is an affirmative filing by a company and their lawyer that says, this is what the project is, this is what they're planning to do, this is the proximity that it is from a piece of critical infrastructure, and this is who we are, this is how we're owned, and you get the drift. Um, and that's by law a 30-day process. It can be quicker, and it sometimes can be longer if CFIUS has questions that require you to sort of withdraw your application and refile. But what a project can do is, if it's within that certain proximity and concern, it can go ahead and file a declaration. It does not really slow down the deal, because I've never seen a deal materialize in 30 days anyways, and they've got a lot of other irons in the fire. They're considering multiple sites. And so if there's a concern, go ahead and work with counsel to prepare a declaration filing and to present the project to CFIUS in an honest, favorable light, and in a way that really paints a picture of the benefit it will be doing for the country and the lack of national security concern it could present. The next step, that may be it. CFIUS comes in and says, hey, okay, you're clear to move forward. They may say, we don't have jurisdiction over this. Or they may say, hey, we're not so sure. We don't like that proximity. Maybe there's a line of sight issue. You can see straight into a sensitive military installation, and we don't like that. Maybe there's flight patterns that you'd be able to monitor that they don't like. Any number of things. And if they want to know more information, they will ask a project, say, hey, we want you to proceed with a notice. And a notice is a much longer form, and it's much more in-depth, and it asks for very granular details about the project, like some of the ones I just mentioned. The process to prepare one can take some time, and then the review process is a little bit longer. And so we're out to 45 days by law for CFIUS to step in, take a look, ask a much more detailed list of questions, and really expect the company to disclose everything about its planned operations and its ownership. And then there's a higher fee for doing this, because the involvement by CFIUS is greater. The outcome is still the same, but you should expect that the more concern they have, the more likely unfavorable outcome would be. And a unfavorable outcome could be as severe as the one I mentioned, where the president blocks the transaction or forces it to be unwound. But those are very rare. It happens about once in administration. The more likely, they're going to ask that the project enter into mitigation agreements. And that may require certain security protocol, that might require access to the site by the US government, and some sort of operational restrictions or reporting requirements. But I will say that these are far more common in M&A transactions. You can imagine the deal I mentioned earlier, where there's data concerns, and there's data sharing concerns. So if for example, a foreign company is going to own, let's say, financial information about US citizens, they may require a segregation of that data. But what we're really talking about is we're talking about real estate only today. And so we're really thinking more in terms of what type of surveillance opportunity and what type of going and coming opportunity there could be. So a mitigation measure in a real estate related deal might be required log keeping for people who come and go, both company and otherwise, from that particular facility, reporting that to the federal government. You get the drift as far as mitigation. But what I'm not talking about really is deal killers. And I would say that I am consistently arguing for projects that are never invested in the United States. This is a foreign direct investment deal. It's our bread and butter in this community, SEDC. That those types of projects should really be afforded the greenfield exception. And when you get the greenfield exemption or exception, that allows you what's called a no jurisdiction letter, and then that CFIUS basically says, hey, we can't do anything with this deal. It's not something we have oversight over, and that doesn't prevent them from coming back later. But I can assure you, and I know for a fact because CFIUS leadership has told me, that going ahead and filing and being proactive is a much better posture than having a ribbon cutting and announcing to the world that this particular investment is going forward or has gone forward, and then getting, like I said, a knock on the door from the non-notified team. That project can expect a very high level of scrutiny and a high level of discomfort and a lot more mitigation. So it's much better to just go ahead and file, run the 30-day period, disclose, and maybe get a non-jurisdiction letter, as it's called, than to just risk it. And it's better for the communities, because the last thing you want to know is after the fact, after the company's invested and after they've hired jobs, that the government's not cool with it. So encouraging your projects to proactively file with CFIUS is a pain. May seem like a pain on the front end, but it could lead to a much smoother operational transition on the back end, and certainly better to know in advance, because there are problems. I mean, I mentioned the Mine One deal, and the Mine One deal is the one where the president told it needed to be unwound. But there's also penalties to the company up to the value of the transaction, meaning they can effectively unwind it, and by imposing severe penalties. The best case scenario is what's called a safe harbor letter. And that's when CFIUS says, hey, we do have jurisdiction over this, and it's not a big deal. We're not concerned about it. And so you might expect to see that in projects that are of very little national concern, and locating in a place that is of very little concern. So in general, I mean, my prediction about CFIUS is, and I suspect that most projects right now are still not filing for CFIUS in advance, and that they're moving forward regardless of concerns and just relying on the greenfield exemption. I think that it passed as prologue, and if past as any trend here, that you're going to see a continued expansion of CFIUS into real estate and economic development deals. So for our purposes, when I'm talking real estate, we're really talking about economic development deals. In addition, it's not just a mere prediction. You've seen it trend, even in my presentation, you've seen it trend from the Fufeng deal, which had a no jurisdiction, to the Mine One deal, which was a presidential block and unwind edict, so to speak. And then furthermore, there's proposed rules currently that will highly likely become law, that FIRMA, that's the act that's this is all based under, be expanded to include a totally new tranche of critical infrastructure, meaning there's going to be a much larger list of bases, and particularly they're interested in Air Force bases, that will now be subject to CFIUS jurisdiction and will require more projects to fall under that jurisdiction. The rules also, like I said here, so we've got about 50 new military bases that are now going to be under CFIUS jurisdiction across 30 states. And they're proposing this sort of two-step evaluation about the radius. I mentioned a 99-mile radius, which is what we've been working with, but now they're talking about a super close and a mid-range. So they're talking 1 mile and a 100-mile radius. So as I conclude, just remember that CFIUS is out there, and think about these things that are really assets to your community: your military base, your port, your airports, your power installations. These are all absolutely assets to all of our communities. The fact that they're assets make them critical infrastructure. And while they can be used to our advantage in economic development, they can trigger national security concern. And the mechanism for reviewing those concerns is through CFIUS. Best practice is to act in a way that trust is the coin of the realm, and to have projects with foreign ownership file a declaration, or at least contact CFIUS to let them know, and ask whether they should file, and be open and honest about the project's operations and its plans. The likelihood of high scrutiny on a project is diminished if a project is open and honest with CFIUS on the front end. What I don't think you'll see is that this kills deals. I don't think you'll see that this kills deals. I think it will be another item on the diligence checklist as you're considering which projects to recruit. So my recommendations are to develop a strategy on the front end. As you're recruiting projects and you're using all the tools in your toolbox, which are great, develop this strategy. Play around with that 802 map that I shared. There's a link in there, and if you want to talk through it, I'm happy to talk through it. So you can identify some of your hot spots, so to speak, for what could potentially be a CFIUS jurisdiction project. And so as you recruit projects, add an extra question. That's who controls the company. And unless you're in one of the exempt countries, which is a very short list, consider whether that particular site is near one of your pieces of critical infrastructure. It's, as I've mentioned, it's a fairly short and straightforward process in order to seek clearance or to disclose the transaction to CFIUS. So it's not going to slow down the deal, and it's not going to kill the deal in all likelihood. And you can sleep better at night having recruited a project, knowing that it's gone through the CFIUS approval, rather than moving forward with the project and wondering whether the non-notified team is going to take notice of the deal later, which is not what you want. So this is a copy of my contact information. And if you need to reach out at any time, feel free. There's my phone number, and Matt and the other crowd has my email address, and I'm sure they'll post it along with this. So thank you for taking the time to listen to a presentation about the Committee on Foreign Investment. I think the growth we'll see in this area is going to change the way we do economic development deals slightly. I don't think it's going to change it to the extent where we're not moving forward with projects we otherwise would have. I just think there's an extra now layer of diligence as the federal government continues to take a higher level of scrutiny over foreign direct investment deals that have proximity and to our critical infrastructure. So thanks very much. Feel free to reach out for any questions, and thanks to SEDC for putting on this event.